writers, you're listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we bring you insights and inspiration for growing your self-publishing business. We're your hosts. I'm Rachel, the author engagement coordinator at Kobo Writing Life.
And I'm Joni, author engagement specialist at Kobo Writing Life. On today's episode, Rachel and Shayna interviewed Eric Rickstad, who is the New York Times and USA Today bestselling author of several dark psychological thrillers. His latest book, I Am Not Who You Think I Am, was released on October 5th. Rachel, how was your chat?
Our chat was great. It was really interesting. We spoke to Eric a lot about his new book, I Am Not Who You Think I Am, which is definitely dark and twisty. And so we talked a lot about how he plots these twists, how he inserts them into his novel, and especially because Eric is not a plotter at all. He actually starts his books with pen and paper and moves from there to creating these very compelling mysteries. And we also talked about why he's so drawn to writing about the aftermath of violence and people who have to live in the wake of a violent act. So it was a really interesting conversation, and I think everyone will enjoy it. All right. We are joined today by author Eric Rickstad. Eric, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Can you start off just by telling our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. This is my sixth novel. I had three novels that were part of the Canaan Crime series set in northern Vermont. One was The Silent Girls. That was my first New York Times and ended up being an international bestseller. I have two other standalones. Reap was my first one. What Remains of Her was a standalone after the series. And then I have this new one, I Am Not Who You Think I Am. I live in Vermont. I've got my lovely wife and two kids. We do a lot of sledding in the winter and just really enjoy our life here in Vermont. Where I'm set is actually a cool place as a writer, because out my window, I can see the mountain that Shirley Jackson based her second novel on.
Oh, wow.
She lived 10 minutes from here, and the town that's 10 minutes from here, she based the lottery on, and she wrote the lottery, and she wrote The Haunting of Hill House 10 minutes from here. I drive by her house frequently when we go get groceries and stuff. So, and Donna Tartt too wrote The Secret History nearby. And so there's a lot of lore and atmosphere here that lends to the sort of Gothic novels I write.
I'm jealous. I love Donna Tartt.
Yeah, me too. Secret History is top notch.
Yeah, and it's set. She wrote it here, and it's set around here too. All the towns that are surrounding us. So that's just an added bonus for already loving her novels anyway. So
that's really cool. Like you said, I Am Not Who I Think I Am is your new book. It's coming out this October. October 5th.
Blackstone Publishing. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the book, what it's about?
Sure. I mean, it's really about devastating family secrets. It's very Gothic. I really enjoy Gothic novels a lot. And it's about a young boy. He comes home and witnesses his father ending his life, or believes that's what he sees at the time when he's 8. Several years later, when he's a teenager, at the time he witnessed this, he found a note at his father's feet, which says, I am not who you think I am. And he hid the note. And within days, his mother rids the house of every sign that his father ever even existed. Everything goes. Everything gets hauled away. And he's traumatized by this, and his younger sister's traumatized. And when he's a teenager, something happens that stops him dead, and he thinks, I don't know who wrote this note. I assume my father wrote it. I'm not even sure it was him in this room that day. And he begins to investigate what happened. And the more he digs, the more he jeopardizes himself and puts himself in great jeopardy. And as a kid, he doesn't have the perspective to realize maybe he should be just leaving this alone. And the more decisions he makes, the more he gets cornered, the less he trusts anyone around him.
So how did you come up with the idea for the book?
So there were two things that really inspired it. As a writer, I'm really inspired, and I've always have been, in style and stuff. But Springsteen's Born to Run, when I was really young, and for its romanticism, but its darkness too. There's a real darkness to some of Springsteen's stuff. The beginning starts with Thunder Road. That's, sort of a very kind of hopeful, song, and Born to Run itself about freedom. And then it ends with Jungle Land, which is a very dark ending. And then Stephen King was another big influence for just sheer storytelling ability. But with this particular novel, I had two things. I had the beginning, because something very similar to what happens to this boy witnessing his father end his life happened to a friend of mine. when he was young, and he never got help. His family moved from DC to Vermont when I was younger, and he was a few years older than me. And no one knew this about him, that he had witnessed his father kill himself. And then years later, after he moved to Texas, when I was in my late teens and he was 21, I was watching on CNN this very first live chase ever on CNN of a fugitive, someone who had just robbed a bank, armed robbery in Denver, Colorado. And I'm watching this unfold, and the CNN helicopter, which was piloted by a Vietnam vet, is following this. And there's the only way the police could actually track this guy running through yards with this bag of cash was from this helicopter. And I was just mesmerized by it. I'd never seen anything like this. It was like 87, I think, 1987. And he kidnaps a person and forces them to drive. And then he runs over a cop live on TV and kills him. And then he crashes that car and he kidnaps another person. And he starts shooting at the helicopter. And finally, this pilot sets the helicopter down in front of the car in a parking lot. And the police are able to converge. And the old man who he had driving this old truck is allowed to escape. And they shoot this fugitive live on TV, killed him. And then they show the mug shot, and it's my friend. And I had no idea this had happened to him. In fact, he had been in prison for kidnapping someone and had escaped and was an FBI top wanted fugitive. And then he robbed this bank as he got more desperate. And I didn't understand it. No one who knew him understood. He was charming, athletic, affable. I watched him save a cow once in a spring flooded creek where he dove under in this icy water to get this cow's foot out of the creek while the creek was rising, frigid, freezing. He was nothing but kind to everyone who knew him, and we didn't know he'd witnessed this. That set up the book. I knew at one point I had to write about the underlying story of what can cause people to do these horrific things, these desperate things. The other thing was the end I had, which was this mansion burning. And in Vermont, where I grew up, there was this big Gothic mansion in this huge estate along Lake Champlain. And, it was sort of secretive. And as a kid, it just had this mythic, sort of mysterious appeal to it, where what's going on this estate, with this preeminent family that's related to the Vanderbilts, and was the estate was, landscaped by the architect and landscapers who did Central Park. So one night, a barn and a home burned down in the middle of the night on this estate, and we lived literally right across the tracks from it. And we went out in our pajamas in this pitch dark night and watched these two structures burn to the ground. And I knew I always wanted to write something about that. And those two things ended up, one was the beginning, this horrific thing, and one was the end. And they were both great and terrifying and emotional. And then I had to write, how does one lead to the other?
That's so interesting. I feel like when you were describing the mansion, it seemed like something that might be real. Like I was thinking like you're out in the country and there's some weird, huge house that doesn't even fit in with the rest of it. And it's interesting that you called them Vanders. That's the family name, right? In the book?
Yeah. Yeah.
Vanderbilt. That's funny.
Yeah. Yeah. And, the reality is different. It's a working agricultural farm now of, for tourists and stuff. In a lot of ways that it is in the novel as well. But that, that fiction, mind for fiction that I have, allows it to be a great setting.
So I'm a writer as well, but I don't write mysteries. So tell us a little bit about like when you're the character solving a mystery throughout the book. So when you're writing that, like, how do you decide when to sprinkle in which clues? And like, do you have to go back and put in more clues because you're like, oh, he figured this out?
Right. That's a great question. Well, my writing process is a little different than some, I think, is in that I'm discovering as the character discovering. I have described it before as I feel very much like I'm a witness. Like I had no idea this boy was going to find Weyland Maynard was going to find a note that said, I am not who you think I am, until he looked down and he saw the note. I didn't know what it was going to say until he flipped it over and read it himself. So in a lot of ways, I'm following these characters who just come alive for me. And I'm discovering things that they're discovering as they discover them. When he goes to the estate, I don't know what he's going to find until he gets there. I don't know what's behind each door. And to me, that's exciting and it's fun, and it can become the challenge. And to answer the second part is, yeah, I go back a lot and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. And I make these great discoveries. Hopefully they're great along the way, all these little pieces, and then have to sort of go back and make sure each one makes sense, and also try to bring them back around at the end in the way I love short stories. And I try to have that sort of feel, chapter to chapter, a short story feel, but also for the whole novel. I love it when not just a twist at the end, but a lot of little things at the end reflect back on the beginning of the novel and give you a real sense of emotion that things have really changed. You've gone a long ways in this novel, and things are not the same, and they're not going to be the same ever again. And I like that sense when I finish a novel, of sort of reflecting back a little bit, looping back on not just the big things, but a lot of smaller things that sometimes can actually have a bigger emotional impact, because they're not necessarily plot driven, but character driven and internally driven. So when things happen to this young boy and who's now a man, hopefully it really registers for readers.
I'm definitely going to come back to talk about your writing process, because I think it's fascinating. But I wanted to talk about your protagonist, Weyland. And like you said, he's a very different kid at the end of the story than he is at the beginning. And I was kind of wondering what it was like inhabiting that headspace of him slowly losing trust and kind of spiraling into this mystery in an obsessive way.
Yeah, I think I feel, hopefully as the reader feels, that, it's one of those books where you'd like to reach in and grab him and tell him, like one of the adult characters does, an old teacher of his, don't pursue this any farther. Let it go. You might be better off believing whatever lies or mistruths or uncertainties you have to live with than maybe discovering something that you can't live with or live well with that will haunt you. So I was, I felt for him, and hopefully the readers will feel for him, because he does things that are extremely surprising and shocking in some ways, that you won't expect as a reader. And it will probably jar you, and it jarred me, because like I said, I don't know what exactly is going to occur. There's a cemetery scene in particular, but that hopefully you have empathy for him and feel strongly for him, despite, I think he's very relatable in a lot of ways. His circumstances are elevated and dramatic, extremely dramatic compared to what a lot of us live as kids. But I think we can relate to his confusion and his need to find the truth and his mistrust of adults, because there's just a generational thing there too, of kids mistrusting adults because their perspective is just entirely different. So hopefully, that's how I felt as I wrote him, discovered more about him.
Yeah, there was definitely.
I felt badly for him by the end. There was no real great way for him to get out of this.
Yeah, there were a couple times in like the first half of the book where I wanted to just like shake him and be like, dude, just like take a breath, take a step back. But then as he starts to become more and more obsessive and just losing himself in this mystery, I was kind of along for the ride with him. I wanted to see what happened. And you're right, he hits a turning point where there's no turning back. And it's really,
and there's parts, that are psychological, have a psychological thriller bent to, where I'm not going to give anything away, but whether or not how much of what he's obsessing over is true and how much isn't. So there's that part of it too for the reader.
I want to kind of talk about the theme of the book as well. And I'm definitely paraphrasing here, but in an interview that I was listening to you give from like 4 or 5 years ago about your last book, you had said that you like to write kind of about the direct aftermath of a violent act and how that affects people who are impacted by that event, not necessarily just solving a mystery, but the wake of violence that people can live in. And I'm just curious, what draws you to that subject matter?
I think, a big thing is my friend going through that and not realizing, because that was so shocking. That I happened to just walk in and watch that live and had no idea it was my friend I was watching, because, he's at a distance down on the ground and the helicopter's way in the air. And, subsequently it was like a Sunday night movie, and it was on like some show, America's Most Wanted Fugitives. And I think the chase is still on YouTube. That all of those things, the shows about him and everything that was told about him was just his violent act, which, is perfectly reasonable. but nothing about what he had endured as a kid. And if that hadn't happened to him as a kid, then he doesn't end up on TV like that. There's just, the two are inextricably linked. There's no denying that. It doesn't justify anything he did. It doesn't excuse it. There's plenty of kids that go through maybe similar tragedies and traumas that don't end up doing that, but they're linked for him, and there's no doubt about that. So when we learned later that this was something he kept a secret, his mother kept a secret, she never got him help. She just moved him and said, we'll just, put it behind us. And he's 15. So I think that really, and then just, there's a lot of novels I like, as a writer, but there's certain kinds that don't appeal to me as much as a crime writer or a fiction or reader, or reader of any sort of fiction, in that when it's just a body count and there's no human ramifications. One of my sisters is a domestic abuse advocate, has worked with the police and universities for a long time on behalf of young women that are abused and assaulted. And she's seen it for 25 years. And I had 3 sisters, and I hear stories from them. So it's all linked to, for me, of when I read something, I want to read about the human ramifications. I really love like Dennis Lehane, for instance, because he really explores that. As riveting as the novels are, they have a human tragic underpinning to them, like Mystic River and books like that. Hawk and Nesser I really like, and they can be entirely entertaining, but I really want to pursue that these are about human beings and what trauma and violence can result in and how it impacts lives permanently. Everyone else moves on, but the victims can't. I
think it's really interesting because even just like in the world at large, well, you watch the news and you just hear about, the violent event or the catastrophe, but the human element is always missing, and just like how it forever impacts a person, like the long-term effects. And I think it's a really interesting, almost character study, which is a weird way to put it, but it's a fascinating realm to look at in fiction.
Yeah. And it's one that, I can't really write about those sort of events without doing that, because it doesn't appeal to me to do it otherwise.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about your writing and publishing journey. So, when did you start writing? When did you first get your first book deal?
Yeah. So I started writing. I mean, when I was a little kid, I was writing and reading all the time. In 3rd, 4th grade, I'd write, they'd ask for a paragraph and I'd write 2 pages. And I had one teacher say, approach my mom and say, did this really happen? And my mom was like, yeah, it did. And I'm like, oh, wow. This is, so there was always that. And in 5th grade, when other kids, particularly boys, were doing other things for recess, I joined up with the 5th grade literary luncheon, where we met with the principal and the librarian for, The Great Brain and Judy Blume and Encyclopedia Brown, and just loved it. My mom was a storyteller and she loved Hitchcock. And then, Springsteen's music and Stephen King's books sort of propelled that when I was junior high. And I just kept writing. When I went to UVM, I just kept writing mostly short stories and poems. And I, had a lot of rejection, like a lot of people do. And then I had some that were taken. And then a teacher at UVM said, you might consider an MFA, which I had never even, considered or hardly even heard of. I was so ignorant of academia and stuff, because I was the first kid in my family to go to college. But so I went to UVA, and that just basically gave me 2 years to write and be expected to write. He's like, you can go there and you can write, and people will expect you to write, or you can go and you can, work and write on the side and go into work where people look at you oddly, like, what are you doing writing? So I was writing this novel, Reap, my first one, which was just going to be another short story, until I sat down and wrote like 50 pages and in, an hour and a half, and was like, well, I think this is a novel. And I was 2 years in before I even admitted to anyone I was writing a novel, because I thought it was very, presumptuous. I sort of protected it in myself, because it's like, oh yeah, who isn't writing a novel? So, and then, when I finished it, I got an agent, and he actually sold it rather quickly. And then I learned something about publishing, which was that even though I got accepted and published by Viking Penguin, it didn't sell as they had hoped, even though it got great reviews, a full page review in the New York Times and Publishers Weekly and Kirkus and all of those places. It didn't sell as they hoped, and they had absolutely no interest in my next novel, none, zero, no one did. And I wrote for a decade without getting published again. Wrote short stories, wrote novels that the agent at the time said you shouldn't be writing this type of novel. And then wrote The Silent Girls. It was one of a couple novels that I had written along the way. I'd get up at 4 a.m. before work. And I wrote The Silent Girl. And I said, I think this one's really good too. I found an agent, and that, I sold probably 500,000 copies worldwide now. And then wrote, 4 books in 4 years, and now have a great new agent with this great new deal with Blackstone and this new book and another book. And I just keep writing because that's what I've done since I was little, and despite the publishing part of it, there's a lot of great things I've learned about publishing, things I might have done differently along the way, but the writing's where I find the real joy and the challenge of it. And it's tough when you're not finding readers through publishing. That's tough. I won't deny that. That was brutal. There were times where I couldn't even go into bookstores because I was like, I'm never going to publish again, but I'm going to keep writing. So writers out there, just keep writing. Just keep writing. That's all that's my biggest piece of advice. And reading, read deep and wide. Read nonfiction, read poems, read poetry, read the back of the cereal box, read everything.
Yeah, 10 years, that's tough. So now with your success, you're writing full time, or do you still have like a...
Yep, I'm writing full time.
Sweet.
Yeah, I'm able to do that, which is fantastic.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then, so you were saying you wrote 4 books in 4 years. So does it take you about a year to write a book start to finish at this point?
Yeah, it takes roughly about a year. Some take maybe a little bit more. Some have taken 10 months. Some have taken 3 years. But overall, on average, about a year, 10 to 14 months or so I can do it, because I'm just sit down and, I love it, but it's my vocation, it's my job. And so, I sit down every day, get up after the kids are gone. And sometimes before. This morning, we got up before the kids to get a couple hours in before, because I knew I was doing this. So it's like, well, I'm going to lose, not lose, but I'm going to dedicate some time to something else. So I'm going to get up early and make sure that I still get that amount of time in today.
That's great. That's dedication.
I was just going to say that's dedication. I did want to kind of touch on your writing process, like I said earlier, because your writing process is a little different, where you use pen and paper, like you use a notepad and a pencil to at least start your books. Can you kind of talk to us about how that process works for you and how you go from notes to final draft?
Yeah. So, again, that was sort of how I started out, in junior high, just writing in your notebook, scribbling things with a pencil. And then there is a connection for me physically. I like the physicality of it. I like how tactile it is. I like being able to scratch out lines and X out whole paragraphs. It's very, very satisfying, and draw arrows here and there and put side notes in the margins, or doodle when I'm bored, and trying to let something subconsciously just come through. But there's definitely a better connection for my imagination to the page when I'm doing it physically like that. And I'll write a good deal of a novel. Sometimes I'll write, just the first chapter and get it going, and then I'll transpose that into a Word document. And by the time I transpose it, I've edited it again in my head. So it's almost like a third draft by the time it's transposed. Sometimes I'll write a lot more longhand before I start to go and transpose it. I've never written the entire novel out longhand first and then gone back and tried to type it in, partly because once it is in Word doc, it's nice to have that ability to go back to something that I can tweak if I'm stuck on new stuff, if stuff's not happening for what I hope to write fresh that day. I can go back and edit and read through what I have in a Word document. And then that usually spurs something new and fresh. So But the other good thing is I can go and take a notebook anywhere. I love being outdoors. I can be outdoors on the back patio or by a stream, or, if I'm waiting at the car fixed, or, waiting for the kids at school or watching them at the playground. Laptops don't lend themselves to being outdoors, and the notebook does. So it's very transportable that way too. In boxes and boxes of notebooks going back a couple decades. So that's kind of cool too, that they're there.
And if anybody's interested, you do post pictures of your notebooks on Twitter. And I'm wondering, and I mean this with all due respect, do you ever have trouble reading your own handwriting?
Yeah, I was going to say that is the biggest detriment, because I really sometimes, over the years looking at the books, you can see how my handwriting has changed / deteriorated into, it's like reading a 20-page prescription, from the doctor. So that is, sometimes I do have to tell myself, because I'm writing so fast, the connection's so present that I write faster than I should. I should slow down the writing so that I can actually read what I wrote. There are times where I'm like, I have no idea what this said. But I can guess, since I wrote it. So I'll figure it out. I'll figure out something if it's not verbatim. But yeah, it does get a little tricky sometimes. My handwriting's worse than my 10-year-old daughter's by far.
So were you writing this book during COVID? No,
I wasn't. This novel I finished up a little while ago. It was going to come out May of 2020, which was decided this is not a good time to put out a novel. Everybody has other things on their mind. Airports are shutting down, and my books, fortunately, are in a lot of airports, and bookstores were literally closing down. And people say, well, reading, we had all that. I was like, I don't know many people who saw it as leisure time when we were, you know what I'll do? I have all this time. I think I'll read all those books I haven't gotten to, now that we're in the middle of a meltdown and there's nothing in the store shelves and stuff. It wasn't quite that type of time, so anyway, that was supposed to come out last year, and now
so it got pushed.
So, but I did write one during COVID. I did write another one. So, but this one was done.
Was it, with all the stress of COVID, was it hard to get your writing done?
I sat down and wrote every day. And I think I didn't realize how difficult it was at the time, from March of 20 to June of 20, when our kids would normally have been in school, they were home and doing Zoom, just, okay, tomorrow the kids are home and they're going to be home. And they were home from March through September, which was great in a lot of ways. It was fantastic in a lot of ways, but it was also difficult to write. I would sit down and I would write. And I think on looking back, I realized, the quality of what I was doing, the attention to it wasn't what it usually is, just out of necessity to having to focus on other things. But, when I went back in and reworked it, I got it right where it needed to be.
I want to just take a step back. This just occurred to me, this question. So you said that your writing process is very organic and you kind of figure things out as you're writing it. You don't really know what the next step is until you've put it on paper. When it comes to I Am Not Who You Think I Am, when during the writing process, did you figure out what your twist ending is going to be? I don't want to give anything away, but It's a pretty big twist. And I'm just kind of curious, when did you know that was going to happen? And how many revisions did you have to go through what you'd previously written to make it work?
Yeah. Well, there's several kind of big twists.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure exactly which you consider the big twist, but, and that's not to say that it's complicated. I kind of refer to this one rather than a labyrinth or a maze, which can get really confusing. It's more like a Russian doll. You keep opening these dolls and you're surprised with each new revelation inside the next one, but you're not confused or lost, hopefully. But I always have a subconscious sense in my head. My subconscious knows, and I trust that process. But it was pretty late in the game where probably about halfway through, I kind of had a pretty good understanding of what was taking place and what the note meant and what the note was. And that was my subconscious at work. That's different from then having to figure out how to make it work, how to arrive at those revelations right at the right time, hopefully at the right time for the reader, where you don't feel like you're dumped on. They feel like they come organically and naturally to the reader. And that can take a lot of work to make it, all of those little reveals feel natural and pay off and not feel like they're over the top or out of the left field. As a reader, and probably most readers don't like that sensation when they're reading, like, oh, that's, that's too much, or that's not connected at all. This is a twist ending, but it's such a twist that snaps off from the whole rest of the book. So hopefully it works.
On your on Twitter, you mentioned that you always want your books to pass the airplane test. Can you tell us what the airplane test is?
Yeah, so that's and I noticed this actually from being on airplanes. Would someone would be reading a book next to me? I'm always curious, especially if they had just finished it. I asked them, what did you think of the book? And I realized if they say, yeah, it was okay, it's good, I'm not going to read that book, because I can tell it didn't do anything for them. Whereas if they say, oh my God, I love this book, I love it, I'll read that, right? Unless I could tell by the cover, it's just not a genre or something I would be interested in. But even with that, I will. And if they say, I hated this book, I couldn't stand it, the ending, I couldn't, I'll read that book too. Because tastes vary, and what they hate might be something I really like. Maybe they hate endings that have a little bit of ambiguity at the end, or aren't, this, or they hate a certain style of writing. But it might be something I really enjoy and love. But that they have a strong reaction either way tells me that even if they hated it, it's going to be a book that they didn't forget. And so I don't write to be contrived, but I write to leave the reader with something that really resonates and is hard to forget and hard to shake. The ending itself, but also the whole book, because of how it ends and reflects on everything else. And I've had readers tell me they've thrown the book across the room out of, loving it, but being like so shocked, like, oh my God, I can't believe this book, or they hated it. And either way, it's fine with me, because there's a strong reaction there. But I think the worst reaction you can have as a reader is, I don't know, it was good. To me, that's just death for me as a reader and as a writer.
I think that's a really good test for
books.
Yeah. Indifference is never a selling point
in the world. It was okay. There's a lot of people who hate really great movies and books and films. People that I hated Breaking Bad, or I hated The Godfather, or I loved, but there's a strong reaction as to why that someone else might really, really enjoy. Often people will say that and be like, oh, really? Because I love that. You hate chocolate ice cream? Wow. Okay. That's weird.
It's weird. Who hates chocolate ice cream? So you did mention that you wrote a book during the pandemic and you reworked it. Can you give us a little sneak peek of kind of what's coming next from you?
A little bit, yeah. This one is about actually an FBI agent who is working on a case that's nationwide of families that are being murdered. And it's just been made clear to the FBI that these are connected. And he has to bring on someone to work with him that he doesn't want to work with at all. This other guy's approach, he thinks, is out of left field. He doesn't believe in what he's doing, but they have to find a way to work together to solve these murders. And this FBI agent has a very dark past of his own that's slowly catching up with him. One of the things it does is it flips the whole profiling trope on its head, meaning, the whole history of profiling, going back to, Red Dragon in the 70s and Mindhunter, the series Mindhunter, which I love it. But this particular FBI agent has no use for profiling. It's never worked. He believes it's a pop culture trope, that it's just implanted itself into pop culture. But really, as an FBI agent and for the FBI, it's really never helped them arrest anyone. Retroactively, you can look and say, oh, so-and-so fit that profile, but the profile didn't help us catch him. Ted Bundy was caught because he had taillight out on his VW Bug. The son of Sam was caught because of a parking ticket. all of the sort of name serial killers, if you will, have been caught through anything except, dedicated, hard work, DNA, and never through, oh, well, this guy, Ted Bundy was to be profiled, they would have profiled him to be a loner loser living in his mom's basement with no social skills, and he would have been exactly the opposite of who he turned out to be, besides the monster he was. But so that's interesting. I mean, to flip that entirely on its head and have an FBI agent that's basically debunking what we've loved and read for 30 some odd years, and I myself included. So, but I loved taking that angle in a character.
Yeah, and definitely with Mindhunter, everyone's familiar with it now, right? Because that show's so
right. The start of it, origin of it.
And where is that in the whole publishing right now? Are you still doing revisions?
It's done, and I'm not sure exactly. We don't have a pub date, but it'll be my next one. I'm not sure exactly when, but probably next year.
That's exciting. It sounds really cool. I love
the title.
Well, titles are weird, so I'm not going to throw it. We have a working title, but who knows what will happen with that. So it's a good one, but I'm not going to throw it out there because I have no idea if it'll stay or not.
Does the publisher have a lot of input into like what the title ends up being? Have they like changed titles on you?
No, I've never. Usually I've come up with pretty decent ones, and I've changed them on my own. And which I do with short stories too, or chapter, sometimes with I Am Not Who You Think I Am, I do chapter titles, almost like each is its own short story, and I'll go back and change those titles. So no one's ever come to me and said, oh, if they did, they would probably be right. Like, this is terrible. I'm like, oh yeah, it is actually. So.
Do you ever have trouble coming up with titles? Because I struggle to put a subject line in an email. So titles are awful to me.
Yeah, they can be tricky. They can be really tricky. Usually I'll read through a manuscript numerous times looking for that thing. Like with the Silent Girls, that was originally, I had it originally called as a title at the time, Fault Lines, which is horrible. I mean, it's horrible for this book and not as gripping. I reread it. And there was a moment where this guy who was a former cop who was investigating this missing girl, and it led to much more, is sort of going over all of their backgrounds and of these victims. And, he's looking at their pictures and they can't tell him what happened and they're silent, and he's tired of looking at pictures of dead girls, of these silent girls. And it just struck me. And I picked that, and it kind of dovetailed at the time with just the very beginning of girl, everything, just before, right? It was after Gone Girl, but it was before this became a thing. So it kind of hit this sweet spot. I wouldn't put girl in a title now for anything, but at the time, it was just there. I wasn't trying to capitalize on something that I saw coming or anything like that. It just made sense to what was going on. It was better than Fault Lines, that's for sure.
All right. So we like to kind of wrap things up with some rapid fire book questions, if that works for you. Just kind of books you like, books you've read.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Sure. Shana, you want to kick us off?
Okay. What's the last book you read and loved?
Right now, I just finished Underland, which is a nonfiction book by Robert McFarlane, and it's fabulous. It's fabulous about everything that happens beneath the surface of the earth, from burying plutonium to graveyards to potash mining in Ireland to, you name it, mining and spelunking. And it's a great book. And I love his writing. I could read it just for the prose alone. That was nonfiction. And then fiction, Steve Kavanaugh's The Devil's Advocate, which was just, I keep coming back to the word diabolical. It was just fantastic. It's just a great, gripping, super thriller. Yeah, really, I don't know how, I really admire the courtroom. Seems like that he gets hyper drama and suspense where you can't stand it. It's great. That was a great one.
What is a thriller you read with a twist that absolutely shocked you?
Dark Places by Gillian Flynn. Yeah, that one That one got me pretty good. And then In the Woods, Ton in French was really great too. I mean, there's a lot, but those come to mind.
Is there a specific book that inspired you to become a writer or motivated you as a writer?
Well, early on, there were, those grade level books, but I'd say, Night Shift by Stephen King, and then Skeleton Crew, it was just before Skeleton Crew came out. I was in the library in high school and picked up Night Shift and was like, what are these stories? Oh my God, these stories are great. They're gruesome, but there's something about the characters and the writing, like, tens of millions of people around the world have come to find. And what else does this guy have? And, he had, nothing much. Carrie, The Shining, Salem's Lot, The Dead Zone, up to that point, 6 masterpieces of Gothic, American horror fiction. Then Skeleton Crew I loved. So, but it was that first collection that I read of his, where, I'd read them as much every chance I got, wake up and start reading them. And then, while I was listening to Springsteen's music. So yeah, that book cracked open things wide. And he made it look so easy, which is really, really, it's not, but he makes it look and sound so easy because they just move. He's just this storyteller. So I found out quickly it's not as easy to do as it looks.
And last question.
Unless it's maybe for him, not for the rest of us.
We can't all be Stephen King.
No.
I wish. Last question is either going to be really easy or really hard. Favorite book of all time?
Oh boy. Yeah, that is really hard. I'd have to say, if I have to pick one, Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. If I had to pick one. And I started that book like 4 times before it stuck. I had no idea what the hell was going on. I'd read 3 or 4 pages and, see the boy, and just be kind of lost because it's so immediate. But once it hooked me, I'll go back to that again and again and again.
Nice. And before we let you go, where can listeners find you online?
So they can find me on Twitter, Eric Rickstad, just strung together, ERICRICKSTAD. And then I have an author's page on Facebook as well, Eric Rickstad author. I should probably get on Instagram at some point, right? That's where it's all happening.
No, you should get on TikTok. That's where it's at.
I don't know where it's at. I don't know where anything's at.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Eric. And your book comes out October 5th, right?
October 5th. Yeah.
Awesome. We will include a link to that in our show notes for sure. It's great.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast. If you are interested in picking up Eric's latest book, I Am Not Who You Think I Am, we will include a link to that in our show notes. If you are enjoying this podcast, as always, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. And if you're looking for more tips on growing your self-publishing business, you can find us at kobowritinglife.com, and be sure to follow us on socials. We are at Kobo Writing Life on Facebook and Twitter, and at kobo.writing.life on Instagram.
This episode was produced by Joni DiPacido and Rachel Wharton. Co-host was Shayna Krishnasamy. Our editing is by Kelly Robotham, and our music is provided by Tearjerker. Huge thanks to Eric Rickstad for being a guest today. If you're ready to start your self-publishing journey, sign up today at kobo.com/writing life. Until next time, happy writing.